Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session on Connecting Economics with Nature, which is part of the Communicate 2011 conference. I'm sorry I can't be with you today in Bristol, but I'm actually at Yale, where we are conducting our first ever program of lectures, graduate lectures, an entire series of 26, which is on Teeb, the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity. It's good that a project that began with research is, in a sense, gone back into the world of academia, because it is about time that the world of academics understood and projected the connection between economics and nature, which for many years, for many decades in fact, has been known about and researched about, but not brought to even the level of economics at graduate and undergraduate level. When we began the project Teeb, the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, we realized we had to communicate these issues, and we wrote separately for the scientists and economists on the one hand, for policymakers on the other, for businesses on the other, and for administrators. And then separately, we also wrote for people. At least that was the plan. So we used to call these Teeb reports D0, D1, D2, D3, D4, D for deliverable, by the way, because I had to communicate to the people writing this report that this had to be done on time. D4, which was Teeb for people, turned out to be a bit of a monster, because whoever we consulted on that thought it was a terrible idea to write a book about the economics of nature. They felt what you needed was just a website which, in a lively, interesting way, provided 5 minutes of learning to people who happen to log in why nature is valuable and why economics does not capture that value and what can be done about it. So in fact, that's what we have today. Teeb for People is not a book, it's a website. It's called Teeb for Me, 4 as in 4. And it has been receiving some hits, but frankly, not enough. Why is that? Let's go back to the beginnings, this horrendous long name called Teeb, the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity. Frankly, at a recent launch of Teeb for Business, the announcer actually confused it and called it the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity. And at that point, I understood that I'd got something wrong, which is the name. I wish, in retrospect, that we had not called it that, which was the official name of the study, but rather that we had called it TEN. TEN, standing for the economics of nature, TEN. It would have been great. 2010 is when it was published. 10 is 10. And it would have been launched in COP10. So I'm afraid we got that opportunity for communications completely wrong. Having said that, Teeb has had some traction. And I think it's up to us now to see where we can take it forward. But more broadly than that, how do we get this message across to people? I would like to suggest 3 different ways in which this can be done. I think firstly, we need to get around and get away from biodiversity. Some of you may recollect that when, after the launch of the Teeb reports, the BBC did a survey asking people what did they think was the meaning of biodiversity, and there were several options. But the option that won was actually biodiversity is a washing powder. Yeah, washing powder. That, I think, tells you something, which is that the word biodiversity itself needs to be gotten away from, and I like nature. Nature is the right word for it. So in some way, if we can convince the Convention on Biological Diversity, the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, and other such biodiversity using talented groups of individuals, that in fact their talents are not being projected because of the language that they use and the moniker that they've adopted. I think that would be a very important step. So that's option number 1. Option 2 is to do with making it relevant to people and their lives on a day-to-day basis. I don't think we do enough of that. I think the world of climate change has actually succeeded in getting its messages better understood. And frankly, I think we need to learn from there. So we need to create the connections, because there are so many, whether it's to do with medicines, or whether it's to do with agricultural productivity, or whether it's to do with enjoyment of national parks and gardens. It is ultimately about nature. It's about the value that we receive. The UK government recently published its survey, the UK National Assessment. I think it behoves us and this group and others associated with us to communicate, pull out the stories from that report, create the communications package around those stories, and then take them out to people, because reports on their own do not actually communicate. And thirdly, and I will say this is not really relevant in the UK, but it's completely relevant in the developing world, the connection between biodiversity, between nature, and the livelihoods of the poor is very important. In fact, for decades, literally for decades, developing nations have been wrought within themselves, have wrought within themselves the idea somehow that there is a trade-off between development on the one hand and biodiversity on the other. And the reality could not be further from the truth, which is that nature, natural capital, is the most important for the poor. It is the lifeline. It is their safety net. And not only that, it is also their means of livelihood. One of the studies that was conducted by us as part of the Teeb project suggested that even though ecosystem services, as we call them, are scarcely a few percentage points if you measure them as a percentage of GDP, but when you measure how many of those ecosystems services flow to poor households in terms of the value of nutrients and fresh water to agricultural productivity on their farms, or in terms of the leaf litter that their cows and goats gather from the forest, or in terms of the fuel wood that their housewives collect from the forest for their cooking. When you measure those values, then the answer is more like 50% to 90%. So any development strategy that does not look at conserving biodiversity as a means of ensuring the livelihoods of the poor clearly has to be relooked at and clearly cannot be right. We need to get this message out, and I think this message is vital because it will pass across to more than a couple of billion people in the developing world, that biodiversity matters, not just as a luxury for the rich, but as a necessity for the poor, as a means to ensure that development succeeds, because it is attending to natural capital, attending to and investing in ecological infrastructure, and building the lives of the poor. So these are my three suggestions for your conference in terms of the word biodiversity, in terms of finding examples on a day-to-day life basis which communicate stories from these reports, and finally in terms of forging and creating in people's minds the deep connection that actually resides between the value of nature and how it flows to the poor. You know, as they say in economics, some things are worth a lot, like a diamond, but they are not very useful. And other things are highly useful, such as water, but they're not worth a lot. This comment, of course, illustrates that we haven't really today understood either the nature of value or the value of nature. But the interesting thing about this comment is that it does not come from some New Age economist. This was written by Adam Smith himself, the philosopher of ethics from Glasgow University, who wrote the foundational work, if you like, in the field of economics. So the theory of economics has recognized these issues that we have between the difference between what is valued by society and what is actually useful to society. And somehow we have failed. We, as a tribe of economists and ecologists and experts in conservation, have failed to communicate in simple enough language to people that this is the case. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that Communicate 2011 will be able to provide solutions, ideas, and an exciting time ahead. All the best. I wish I could be there with you, but I cannot. But I'm doing my little bit to ensure that at least to the academic communities that I attend to these days, that communication does take place. Thanks very much indeed.